We're going to bring on our very distinguished panel, and beginning with Marc Bamuthi Joseph. Morning, Marc. Jonathan Martin. Good morning, Jonathan.
Good morning.
Damian Snead. Hi, Damian.
Hi, how are you?
Louise Toppin.
Good morning.
Hi, Louise. And Stephanie Ybarra.
Morning.
Hi, Stephanie. Well, welcome all. Thanks for joining us today. And we're gonna do this, in a rather informal way. Alysia and I will, pose some questions, and we'll keep it very conversational. Of course, we'll look forward to getting questions and comments from the folks that are listening in and watching today as well. I do want to just kick off with one question for all of you to ask you for a response on, and that is to say, how would you each characterize the state of ADEI in the performing arts world today? And I'd like to ask each of you just take 2 or 3 minutes and give us your view of that. And by the way, it would be helpful if you just wouldn't mind also just mentioning your current affiliation. Everybody has this in the in the bios that have been provided, but just in case they haven't had a chance to look at that, they'll know. Marc, you want to start?
I should have put my finger on my nose. Well, I am really grateful that we're having this conversation. I would say that part of the work that we have to do is abandoning the acronym if we can. That DEIA or IDEA or whatever, and particularly DEI work sounds like one syllable. And these 3 very different things tend to be conflated. We have at least 4 issues. Diversity or representation is an issue unto itself. Inclusion is an entity unto itself. Access is an entity unto itself. Equity, for me, is the most important of these, particularly for those of us who use the phrase anti-racist. I actually don't believe that we can be anti-racist because of the inextricable relationship between American capitalism and racism, but I do believe that we can incline towards systemic allyship. If we're going to use the term, then I think that a focus on equity that thinks about power and agency and programs, worldviews, pedagogies, practices, and pipelines that reflect an inclination towards ceding power to historically stigmatized or historically marginalized communities is a kind of North Star that we currently don't have. That said, so I don't expect the world of arts to fully climb the mountain of white supremacy or the mountain of marginalization with an orchestral concert or a commissioned libretto. So we start where we are. We start with the beginning, and so many of us need to begin to start with diversity of ideas, of bodies and cultural histories, of worldviews. I think we then graduate to a space of inclusion, which is to say the work that is necessary in order to create systemic belonging. And if we're doing that work, then we broaden to access, a welcoming of all beings. And then we get to equity. The problem with saying DI is not only are we conflating the conversation, but we tend to just think of it as the first thing. And the conversation that I would love to have is more about power. Some of the work that we're doing at the Kennedy Center, and I should have started with that, Fred, my apologies. I'm the Vice President and Artistic Director of Social Impact at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., which is the unceded territory of the Anacostia and Piscataway people. Some of the work that we're doing really thinks about pipeline program and the cultivation of equitable systems for specific historically marginalized communities. In the classical music space, we focus on a project with the Washington National Opera and the National Symphony Orchestra called Cartography, which is a commissioning project, but it's also a project that that leverages the import of both the opera and the symphony to create wealth surrounded or orbiting the topic of Black dignity, and specifically creating wealth and equity spaces for families who suffered under state-sponsored violence. So we use the Cartography Project as a means of generating income for the Philando Castile Foundation, for Breonna Taylor's foundation, for a scholarship in Freddie Gray's name, for a foundation set up in Nia Wilson's name, one for Elijah McClain, et cetera. So what's the state of this conversation? One, let's specify, strategize, better intentionalize, and get to the core of power in this conversation. And then let's continue to set up programs that not only diversify the stand or diversify staffs, but also seek to create equity profiles for those communities that been historically stigmatized by the social pathologies in this country.
Thank you, Mark. I'm just going around my screen. I'm going to go over to Jonathan.
Thank you, Fred. And Mark, thank you for, we don't know each other, but that was a very powerful way, I think, to get things started. Having been in the orchestra field and only the orchestra field for 42 years, I am probably, if I'm qualified for anything, I'm qualified to speak maybe on behalf of our sector to answer Fred's question. And it is, I would say that it is uneven, inconsistent. I see different rates of velocity of change from orchestra to orchestra. In all candor, I see a significant part of our sector doing little more than checking boxes, and I think that we've got a long way to go. I guess from my perspective, if you break it down into, the so-called stakeholders of a classical arts organization, your board of directors, the audiences, the musicians, the artistic leadership, the staff, the volunteers. What that misses is the community, and the community should be the ultimate stakeholder for an orchestra. And I'll use Cincinnati as an example. We take in $35 million a year out of Cincinnati. And if we are not trying to deconstruct how we think of community, serving our community in a way that elevates our relevance and value, then we're not delivering on the promise that an orchestra can be, what an orchestra can do and be in a community that goes well beyond, full orchestra performances. I'll leave it that it is uneven. There are orchestras that I think are moving more quickly than others. I will say that the League of American Orchestras, which is our primary service organization, we are starting to see signs of change there, that for the first time in a long time. There's a lot more I could say, but in the interest of time, I'm gonna leave it at that.
Thank you, Jonathan. And as somebody who spent 20 years in the orchestra business, I appreciate your thoughtful recounting of all of that. Over to you, Damien.
Hello, everyone. My name is Damian Snead. I'm a multi-genre artist and arts educator, currently affiliated with Manhattan School of Music. I identify as he, him, and I'm in the land of Lenape here in New York City. I totally agree with Marc's response. I think he said it very succinctly and put the head on the nail and nail on the head, so to speak, because this will continue to be something we have to discuss and an issue, something to think about as long as we have these acronyms, as long as institutions need to hire diverse staff members, as long as they need to have these discussions, but we must have the discussion. It's good during the pandemic and around the time of the pandemic when all of us were trying to pivot and trying to figure out ways to be creative as artists, being sequestered inside. And with the untimely death of George Floyd, our nation began to look not just at our present, but really look at our past. In my opera, Marian Anderson, her story called Marian's Song, the main theme is 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And that's one thing that I've seen from marginalized people, marginalized cultures, people who have to deal with any type of racism, any type of discrimination. It seems like we're making 2 steps forward and then we're making 1 step back. On another note, I've found that whenever you're going through a purging process in your own personal life, you find out that there are things that will be identified within yourself that you may not have known, those deep-seated things. And I think this is what conversations like this, Fred, help us to come to find out the mindsets, the ideologies that we've placed in our head that have been taught to us, that have been practiced, that have been rehearsed from institutions, from our education system, things that we all need to consider in being not people of cancel culture, not people of pointing fingers, but ways to heal, ways to move forward in unity. To be brief, one thing that I'll say, I think one thing that we should focus on is not just the visible seats of artistic expression, such as making sure that an opera company has diverse singers in the main roles, or making sure that we have a few African-American conductors, or making sure that an African-American orchestra is represented in a specific concert hall. I think it goes beyond that. We have to have more people like Marc Bamuthi Joseph. We need more people of color, people who you won't see as librettists. We need more people of color and people you won't see as concert program writers. We need lighting people. We need people who are behind the scenes. We need accompanists and vocal coaches. It's not just a few positions, put some people there that are visible to make it look like we're applying a Band-Aid to the situation, but it has to be equity all across the board, no matter of someone's culture, their race, their beliefs, no matter of their identity. We have to make sure that America, so to speak, becomes a melting pot, as it's not really, maybe a salad bowl with certain things withheld, or people are being picky as we can go to restaurants and choose what we want. But globally, that our scope of music, as my colleague Garrett McQueen so wonderfully stated, becomes something that is culminating and that is complete and whole. So we have to rewrite history, and we really have to start now with the 2 or 3 generations after us to give them a new scope, a new slate, and to write anew. And I think this is a perfect way to get there. Thank you.
Thank you, Damien. That was a really thoughtful comment. comments. Louise.
Thank you so much, Fred and Alysia, for having this conversation and for inviting us to be a part of it. And thank you to my colleagues already, Marc, Jonathan, and Damien, who have spoken so eloquently about this present moment. I would say that I represent, I'm an opera singer, I'm a professor of voice at the University of Michigan, but I'm also the former director of the music program at UNC Chapel Hill. So I've come from the education administrative side, and I've run the nonprofit Videmus that has been focusing on the music of African Americans and women since 1986, which is the year I graduated with my second master's from Peabody. So I'm very honored that this is my institution as well that is having this conversation. Yes, Alysia. And I would say for me, this has been a dizzying moment. And I say dizzying because everyone jumped on the bandwagon to make a change. And I think a little bit of what Marc said, that these are separate issues. And the dizzying part was certainly jumping in to try to figure out, let's change our curriculum. Let's put on new concerts. Let's put on new operas. Let's now reflect these stories without getting to some of the roots of the issues which are the access. If people of color and people of the community you want to represent are not in positions of power, this does not have sustainability. This is a moment that will continue for a little longer, and people are already tired. So it isn't going to help us with the true change and the true acknowledgement of these stories and this music for the long haul. This will just be another moment. I was talking to my mentor and former teacher, George Shirley, the other night, and that's exactly what he was saying. We've had moments before. We've had these acronyms before. So this is not new, but it's how we respond now and the opportunity we have now to, when we add new positions, to add support, when we bring on someone to change or be the DEI person for an organization that has never had them. How do we support that? What's the funding? What's who are the people around that are going to be able to really make a change so that it's not, I think one of you two said, checking off boxes where we just add a person so that there is a new viewpoint at the table, but there's no real power behind that. There's no real sustainability and access. So I will just end by saying, in looking at all of these segments, certainly education jumped very quickly in response to students after 2020, at the pandemic and the death of George Floyd. It caused institutions to try to figure out what classes can we add. But the students were asking for, how can we change our industry? They weren't asking for necessarily new classes. They were asking for us to be thoughtful and talk about what are the new opportunities to do this career differently, to represent all people and have a new viewpoint in there. In the opera world, it's the same thing. There was a rush to do a lot of new works, but how were audiences brought into what they were going to say, brought into the stories and really given an opportunity to take ownership of what they were going to see. So there's much more, I think, that goes behind the scenes that still has to be done if this is to be a sustainable rather than a moment in time. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. And Stephanie.
I'm really appreciating just listening here and reveling in the brain trust. So thank you to all of you for your words. I'm still Stephanie, and I'm the artistic director at Baltimore Center Stage, and I'm zooming in or streaming in from the unceded territory of the Piscataway and Lumbee people, who are still very much alive and with us today. And I am also on faculty at the Juilliard School in the drama division. So the conversation around students and learning hits really close to my heart. When I initially, Fred, when you asked the question of where are the performing arts in all of this, my simple answer was, we're performing it. We're performing all of these things. We have not yet actually learned how to address what my colleagues here have already invoked, the systemic nature of the problem and the way that is connected to the power structures of our society. And I think that once we start to understand the systems and see ourselves within the systems, then and only then can we actually properly diagnose what's operating at a micro level and a macro level inside of our institutions and across our industries. And I think that we've talked a lot about the outward visibility of diversity, and I feel really compelled to say that I want to double down on that and just underscore what Marc invoked in terms of connecting that to power. And I think that there is a lot that can go on behind the scenes in terms of how we activate power. And some of it is about resourcing individuals or programs or what have you, but it really does not have to, it is not all that. And I want to give you one very specific example with regards to the word power, just the vocabulary that we use. I was watching in the comments and I see it's very common to hear the word empower. You need to empower people, empower, which by definition is giving power, which presupposes that somebody does not already have it inside of them, which is a complex idea when we start talking about structural power. But just the vocabulary that we use in how we talk about uplifting, empowering, presupposes that there is one group of people who has it and needs to give it instead of reinforcing the idea that we all have it within us and can activate it. So the final thing that I'll offer to this already very rich conversation is I wouldn't be in these conversations without pulling up my book, my very well-worn book, Emergent Strategy, and turning to the page where Adrienne Maree Brown says unequivocally, unapologetically, art is not neutral. Art is not neutral. It either upholds or disrupts the status quo, advancing or regressing justice. And that's not just about what is happening on our stages. It is every decision at every moment, whether we're administering, facilitating, generating, or interpreting art, we all have a chance to disrupt or uphold. And those chances or those decisions, I think, even bringing awareness to, in this moment, I'm upholding the status quo. Okay, so be it. Moving forward, try to do better next time. I feel like that's the level of rigor I would love to see us employing as individuals, but also as an entire sector.
Thank you, Stephanie, and all for those really, really thoughtful introductory comments. And Alysia, you have a question for the group?
I do. And I'm so grateful that we've already brought in some Black feminist thinking, hearing from Adrienne Maree Brown through Stephanie Ybarra. So really grateful for that. That really helps us to kind of ground the conversation as well. We'd love to hear, as Stephanie was giving out some of those words of empower, another word is outreach, right? All these different ways that we talk about the ways that arts organizations or institutions can interact with community. So we'd love to hear some examples that you all can share with us of some recent, I loved hearing about the cartography project. We'd love to hear more. Some recent works or progress that are being made by institutions around achieving equity and inclusion in the performing arts. Maybe something that's inspired you or something that you're a part of. And if it's something that inspired you from someone else, if you'll share a little bit about, how it's informing maybe the work that you're planning to do or the work that's coming. I'd love to know who maybe would like to kick us off with just sharing these examples of groundbreaking work around equity and inclusion. All right, Damien.
One thing that the president of Manhattan School of Music, James Gandry, known as Jim Gandry, initiated during the pandemic, even we were in an online setting and then switching to hybrid meetings and now in person. And it's still a requirement that all students, when they perform, doesn't matter if they're doing a recital, does not matter if they're doing a virtual performance recording, and are any performances in the school that people are able to attend, that all performances must include works by African and or African American creators. Uh, Everything, not just jazz music, but for classical, for musical theater, everything has to include that. And what that's done, it's forced the faculty, my colleagues, it's forced students to now do a deep dive and a deep dig of research into finding things like Videmus, like Dr. Toppin's wonderful research and work, which provides a list, recordings and scores and background information about the creators, the composers, for students to be able to perform these works. Because the issue or the topic or the question or the point of concern was, well, what can we do? We don't have enough works to perform. Are we only going to perform Scott Joplin? Are we only going to perform Harry T. Burleigh spirituals, not even knowing that Harry T. Burleigh wrote art songs as well? Are we going to do Duke Ellington? But now there's been a drive and a push in our library to get these scores and to have these recordings, but also the students now understand the importance of understanding the creator, what the creator, the composer, the librettist, what they were trying to say. And also now we are shifting their mindset from just being performers instrumentally or vocally, but now to having conversation. What is your job? What is your role as a performer? What is your calling? Why are you here? What more can you add to the musical thread and the fabric and the quilt that we already have? So now we're getting active thinkers. So performers are now thinking about the works that they're performing. They're thinking about programming. They're thinking about having a voice and giving voice to those who don't have a voice, and now saying something with their art. And I think that's a great thing that's been initiated at Manhattan School of Music.
That's really fascinating, Damien. Thank you for sharing that example. I see in the chat, lots of folks are just chiming in. They're happy to hear you say not just jazz. We know that that's a common place where we see a lot of tokenization of Black musicians on concert stages and in institutions. And also just for being transparent about that idea of that freeze moment of like, well, what will we do? Because many of us that have been trained in classical music traditions, right off the top of, if you are asked to name 10 women or 10 Black composers or 10 Asian composers, you would be hard pressed to do so, right? So this idea, that freeze moment, but pushing past the freeze, it sounds like that's also what that policy is doing. We'd love to hear from some more folks.
Louise, I think there you go.
Yeah, since Damien mentioned my work, can I go ahead and segue in and just add a little bit more? And thank you for that, Damien, that at Michigan, we've, in addition to what he suggested, we've actually instituted having students that audition or apply to Michigan, they have to include diverse repertoire in their, before they can get in the door. So that's a part of our repertoire requirements. And then once they're there, every studio we have as a department, the voice department has every studio has to do women, living composers, African Americans. So we give them some guidelines to start that inquiry into areas that they wouldn't have worked on before. What I've also been trying to do just personally, I teach an African American art song course that the students take. So they're getting an opportunity to engage with this repertoire in a course that is on the level with the other courses that they take. I've been doing a lot of work on spirituals and teaching dialect as a language and bringing a positive or a new spin to this music that's our foundational music, and what Burleigh was trying to say, that we need to look to the spiritual as our roots for all of our other music, including the classical trend. I created a research data, which what he's mentioning is my research database at African Diaspora Music Project.org. And it is intended, I've worked really hard over these years, and I've been working on it for 30 years as a document that's a living website that if anyone has no knowledge about this music, I've tried to create a space for them to say, I know I'm a soprano, I know nothing else, or I know I'm an orchestra and I know what my instrumentation is. We have both the orchestral and the vocal music at this point so that people have an entree to this music and scholars that they can reach out to. Most of all, I think what I've been, and in terms of the lack of accessibility, all of my work has been to try to move the needle a little bit and say, okay, you were trained as a singer, but that doesn't mean you can't become a lecturer or a scholar or begin to publish. When I saw there was no music being published, I began publishing it. And it's now being distributed by major publishers. So I pushed my way into those spaces because I didn't see us getting there in the classical vocal realm. And I've continued to try to bring all others of us along into these spaces. And so what I've been trying to show is that career that started off on the stage as a singer has morphed into, as Damien has said, and as Garrett was saying, it's morphed into a lot more. It is a response to what people need in terms of understanding this music, engaging with it, and going further with it. So I hope that it's also an inspiration for people to realize that there aren't limits. You can push your way in and help with what needs to happen in terms of DEI.
That's so fascinating, Louise, just because that connection between you and Damien, but then you're also connecting your work to that pipeline piece that Marc brought up, right? About how we introduce lots of different options in the sphere of art making, having diversity in all those different places. So that's really exciting to hear how your tool can be used to also connect there. I think I saw, Marc, did you just unmute?
I did. And thanks again. I love hearing Louise and Damien talk about epistemologies, about centering content, and maybe what I'd like to additionally offer is that there are epistemologies and there are pedagogies. An epistemology is just that, is a kind of series or litany of things that we should know. Pedagogies are frameworks for understanding and for disseminating the information. And what I find in our sector is that we don't have enough pedagogies. We don't have enough pedagogues that take curatorial positions in our various institutions. So one of the things that I do in my consultancy work and in the workshops that I host as part of Sozo Vision with my partner Rika Eno is we talk about 4 Ps. We talk about pipeline, we talk about program, we talk about profile, but we really focus on pedagogy. The pedagogical work is to say, what is your institutional theory of change? And it's important to have one because there's essentially a causal link between the art that you're producing, maybe a public process that results in that art, and then a call to action or an actionable component. I used to think that the future was just inevitable. And maybe one of the things that I want to also bring into the room is this idea of cultural design or pedagogical design. And I want to lift up an institution in San Francisco, Yerba Buena Center for the Arts, as I kind of connect those dots. So, Rika and I are influenced by the work of 2 white men, of Stephen Johnson and of Jim Dator. Jim Dator's a futurist. He talks about 4 different kinds of future, or 4 different ways of speculating about the future, that there is a growth trajectory, which is to say we start here and we just kind of continue in a straight line. There is the idea of future that is predicated on the idea of collapse. It all falls down, Mad Max. There's the idea of the future that's about constraint, which is very likely that there'll be more people, fewer resources, and building a future or envisioning a future in that way. And then there's the idea of the transformative future. The reason why we're having this conversation is because art is transformational. I love that Stephanie invoked my friend Adrienne Marie Brown. And so at your most optimized, as a cultural organization, are you growing? Are you constrained? Are you collapsing? Or are you transformative? How does a culturally transformative organization think about equity? And importantly, how does a culturally transformative organization think about social design in terms of a future making paradigm? We're not just reconciling numbers and shame. We are designing a future, which means incorporating artists not just as performers, but as intellects around problem solving and future design. And so the work at Yerba Buena Center really focused on thinking about the Performing Arts Center as an incubator, centering artists and creative inquiry as part of a civic discourse. This is work that we started doing about 10 years ago. And without getting too deep into it, you can look into the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts Fellowship Program. You can also look at sozovision.org. But the work at Yerba Buena Center has eventually led to a universal basic income for artists in the city of San Francisco. And so I want to lift that up because it speaks back to the equity paradigm that I was talking about earlier. If we think about artists the way that we think about economists, if we think about artists the way that we think about legal scholars or healthcare workers, if we stop saying, what is the art doing for the diversity and equity conversation, and spoke more about like, why isn't our healthcare system more like making a dance? Or why isn't our banking system more like crafting poetry? If we gravitated more towards thinking about artists as civic problem solvers, then I think what that would lead legislators to do is to consider the importance of artists as central to the cultural edge and the financial edge of their particular municipality. So I would shout out Yerba Buena Center for being futurist in their thinking about equity within the civic discourse.
May I jump in?
Please, Stephanie. Yeah, of course.
Cheeks hurt. I'm smiling so hard because Yerba Buena Center was on my bingo card as well in terms of thinking about inspirational work and institutions. And the thing that I'll also double down on and underscore what Marc is saying in terms of the civic discourse is that the institution, the organization has positioned itself as essential to civic life in its community. And that feels really important for cultural institutions. And at Baltimore Center Stage, on any given day, I will have success or deep failure in making that argument about how arts institutions and theater, I mean, in my vocation, my discipline of theater, it is literally what the art form was born of, to be central to civic life. And instead of putting it over there where civic life happens over here, that feels part and parcel of the sort of seeing ourselves in the system and then understanding how we contribute not only to the solutions, but also to the problems of the systems. And since we've already spoken about Yerba Buena Center, I wanted to call out that somebody in the comments earlier had already dropped the link to We See You White American Theater in the chat, and so I want to re-engage with that particular link to say that this goes back to power and who has it and how we activate it. And I just want to lift up the We See You White American Theater organizers, because that is a group of artists who organize themselves and are attempting to hold an industry accountable. And And the thing about individual power is that it becomes a force multiplier for other individual power. So as we're talking about civic discourse or pushing or connecting art to legislative action, et cetera, I don't want to lose the part where you do not need to be inside of an institution and a legislator within an institution to impact change, and organizing across individuals and activating power, creating more power. My friend Eric Liu wrote a book called "You Are More Powerful Than You Think," and inside of it, he offers up 4 laws of power, and one of the laws of power is that it is infinite. It's infinite. It is not a zero-sum game. And so as we're talking about this, I wanted to layer that into the conversation. Organizing is force multiplying of power, and I think we could stand to have a lot more of it.
Are there other responses to Alysia's question? You know, one of the things that I'm just want to comment on when Damian was talking about some of the things going on in his school, that I think it's a really interesting. One of the things that we are working to do right now is, as an outgrowth of the work that we've been doing in curriculum, broadening the curriculum and expanding the range of creative voices in the curriculum, is to actually, I think transparency is a really important part of this conversation. And so devise a mechanism by which, you know, we can publicly state, you know, and show by department in our place what is going on in this really important area. You know, what percentage of works are being performed, you know, that, so that really is it, because it will differ from area to area. And I think it's, you know, the idea of transparency and holding people accountable will be a really important part of this progress, I think. I just want to make that comment. I'm interested in, and I know I'm mindful of time also, because I know we've got probably lots of questions in our audience, and I want to give folks a chance to ask that. But I want to ask maybe. Maybe I have a lot of questions I'd like to ask, but I'm trying to think of something that would be, I want to get to the, you know, the core of something here, which is, what is the one thing, because we've got folks here that are running institutions, from institutions, listening in. What is the one thing that that every institution, in your view, anybody who cares to comment on this, in our field, and when I say our field, I mean whether it's an educational institution or performing arts professional, performing arts organization, whatever it might be, should start doing, and the one thing that they should stop doing to advance the cause of everything that we're talking about today? Jonathan, you look like you want.
So I as I listened to the extraordinary conversation going on, I feel like the guy on the ground who's sort of so focused on execution and how to redeploy the $35 million a year back into the community. I don't know that any of my comments are going to be as maybe inspiring as what I'm hearing. That said, you know, if you were to use the start and stop model, I would say stop repeating, stop acting on rote, stop publishing audition excerpt lists that are the same as 50 years ago. You know, we run home to mama whenever we're threatened. And so much of this for me, I wish I were a behavioral psychologist, because I think a lot about fear of loss. You know, what are the motivations for holding on to the sameness? It's fear, and it's that I'm gonna take something away from you. And I need to understand that better, and maybe you guys can help me with that. But stop repeating. Start with a blank piece of paper. in everything that you're doing, programming, hiring, how you populate a board, how you raise money, how you spend money. And, you know, in my world, power, there's a lot of connective tissue between power and money, and how we spend that money. I also think that we should start understanding and getting comfortable with being uncomfortable over sustained periods of time. You know, I work in a field where the organizations, in all candor, including mine, are deeply calcified. The only way that you can make forward motion is to be, you know, get okay with conflict and discomfort, and understand fear, and you know what is motivating this clinching of the same. So that's a long answer to your question, Fred, but, you know, stop doing the same and start getting comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Thanks, Jonathan.
I'd like to add to what Jonathan just said. Thank you for that, Jonathan. It is stopping, but it's also, a lot of people are getting advice, but are they actually listening? And that's what concerns me. So that, yes, stop. And this moment, people have stopped, I think, a little bit more, but stop, listen, engage with the population that you actually want, and genuinely engage with the population that you hope to engage before restarting and making plans, I think is another part of the whole equation. And that's what I was saying about the students, not just jumping to respond in one way. You're not really hearing what they said. You're just responding. And I think in all of our organizations, we're doing that same thing. We're moving to do something, but we're not genuinely stopping for the conversations that need to be had to get us to really think about the true issues. That takes us back to Marc's initial answer of what is the issue we're trying to address, and how do we get there sustainably?
Thank you, Louise. Anybody else want to take a whack at that? Marc?
Yeah, I want to take a whack at that. I love that. I love this question. Start populating your boards with artists. 20% of your board should be artists. And I say that because if I were to look at most Fortune 500 companies, they ain't got no artists on their boards. If I look at the top 500 arts institutions in the country, they got everybody but artists on their boards. So if we're talking about power, and we're talking about leverage, and we're talking about discourse and conversation, if we're talking about epistemologies, and we're talking about pipelines, do that. The reason why I say 20%, because I see that question in the chat, is because, again, I advocate for the notion of the adjacent possible. I don't think many of us can get to 50% boards, and I understand that we have governance issues, we have fiduciary responsibilities, we have to generate. I don't think that arts institutions should be intentionally social justice organizations. I think that social justice is implicit and inherent in the enterprise of art and art making. So let's start where we can start. Speaking of, stop using performance as an endpoint. So many things that we do in our kind of programmatic agenda lead up to the performance, which really means that we're cultivating audience. We're cultivating diverse audiences towards a particular performance, as opposed to cultivating a social vision and using the performance as an epistemological piece to get to the social vision, as opposed to using the community to get to the performance. So stop using the performance as an endpoint, start using the performance as either a starting point or a midpoint towards a social vision. Which, third, start hiring social visionaries. Just start hiring social visionaries. And I shouldn't say just start flippantly, but the integration of a social agenda as married to a curatorial purpose is one of the things that I think we're missing in the sector. Jonathan, I really respect what you were saying about the relationship between inspiration and execution. I don't think these things have to be bifurcated. I think that the execution of social inspiration, there is no social inspiration without execution. Inspiration without execution is just theory. And we know how we feel about theories in this country, especially critical ones. So what is the co-joining of inspiration and execution? I think it is the hiring of social visionaries in executive positions so that we execute on a creatively inspired social pathway, in addition to a creatively inspired musical or kinesthetic pathway.
Damien.
That's great. His comment just made me think. I saw in the comments earlier, someone utilized the word intersectionality. I think it's important too, when staffing and building these cohorts and teams, these think tanks, that there are people on board who already are exuding and exemplifying intersectionality. People who are not just performers, as he said, getting to the concert, people who are not just thinkers who deal with aesthetic and principle and not actually in the trenches, so to speak, and to find people whose work is definitely that of intersectionality, where it connects the lines and blurs and eradicates any lines of delineation that have been placed on us with commercialization, with categories and categories to get a prize that's a piece of plastic that you stand on a stage and get. Nothing against those, but things that people want to say, put you in a box. Well, you're this type of artist, or you're this type of creative, and you're this type, and you belong over here. And this is your jargon. This is how you dress. This is what you do, because those are the types of new faces, new artists, new generational people, the young people, the generations coming after us. They deal with intersectionality. They don't see things bifurcated as just this and that. They see things more so as in a multidisciplinary approach, an approach where there is no genre. You can see that throughout fashion. You can see it even now in the performances that we're staging, where we're blending things together. So I think that's very important, that we find people who are not just thinkers and not just able to communicate it with their language and with the study of, but artists and people who've spent life work or who are trying to exemplify and exude intersectionality in everything that they do.
Thanks, Damien. Hey, Alysia, do you want to ask another question, but one more question before we go to getting questions from our listeners today?
Absolutely. And I just want to also just chime in that what Marc just shared really will dovetail into this afternoon as we begin to think about the ways that training programs, public schools, conservatories are preparing artists for this new landscape, right? This new expectation around what we expect from our artists, not just to show up with the technical proficiency to transport us to new places, but to show up with a theory of change themselves for what their worldview and experiences, right? How it shifts the way that they enter the space and their artistic output. So I'm really excited for that connection of those conversations throughout the day. So hopefully folks are sticking around. So we've heard a little bit in the beginning just about your what you're seeing as what's already there. We've heard a little bit about what's happening now. I think we should ask a future question, right? What is this future that you imagine? What do you imagine, right? How do you imagine the liberatory artistic future? What's involved? What does it look like? What does it feel like? What does it sound like? Maybe even smell? But what are we working towards?
I guess
I wanted to give a few moments of,
Yes.
the liminal space needs a breath. Yes. And Jonathan, we'll kick it off with you.
And clearly it's established that I'm more of a noun and verb human here, and sort of on. So if you believe that the power of art has almost a intoxicatingly unifying ability, and if you believe that and in my world, I can only speak with orchestras, that orchestras in many communities, the amount of resources that have been put into orchestras and communities over the decades give the orchestras an obligation and an opportunity and a responsibility to change how we've been turning that around and delivering it, instead of delivering it to 4% of the community. What if we could, continue to increase that the arms being open, every year, to where it becomes a community orchestra, in the sense that the question of relevance and value is just much expanded in the community. So if you believe all of that, then I actually have a sense of optimism if you think about the role of an orchestra in a fundamentally different way, and not defined by the past. Let's be candid. We have the resources as a field to make an enormous difference in this conversation. And the leadership, and that includes me, we have to have the hardest questions discussed at the board level and the community level and the artistic leadership level, to reimagine what a collection of musicians and resources can do with a community. I've never seen, in my 42 years in the business, I've never seen a depth of richness, artistic richness, that want to engage with, so-called classical arts organizations. And so I think we're in a moment here that can make a difference. I don't know if I answered your question, but I'm trying.
Yes, you did. Thank you so much. Yes, let's hear another thought.
I think a lot. Yeah, I think a lot about the physical and sort of a spiritual place of the arts in civic life, in everyday civic life. And I'll confess that I'm still actively developing my own theory of change, my own vision for what exactly I'm reaching for or what I want to see. But I know it looks something like this. I know it looks something like when something happens, when there is an inflection point or a lightning bolt moment, good or bad or somewhere in between, when that happens in our world, whether that our world being a very hyper local sense of the word or a literal global sense of the word, my hope is that we return to a place where all eyes and ears then shift to the artists. What are they going to say? How are they going to help us make sense of what has just happened? Or how will we imagine ourselves out of this reality because we're reaching for another reality? And I think that I want desperately for our artists and our arts and culture institutions to be that critical to everyday life in our communities. And I think what goes along with that, what kind of goes hand in hand, is that I am also reaching for a world in which our communities are physically financially, spiritually invested beyond the 30 to 50 people who sit on our boards, or beyond the, couple hundred people who are paying the bills, that we would have investment at a critical mass of investment, and I use that word very broadly, within our communities, such that it would be very hard for any one decision by an arts institution, if it were, to be, how am I saying this? I'm sort of stumbling through this, but it's like, I experience this a lot in my discipline, where if I make a decision that I feel is in alignment with the values of me, my institution, then if it does not sit well with a handful of people, they could in theory shut down the entire organization. And that's actually that's a real thing. That is a real threat. And so what might happen if we spread out that power, that level of investment, so that more than just a handful of folks have a say in how the values are manifesting in our arts organizations? And those two ideas go hand in hand for me.
That explanation about distributing power is so powerful, Stephanie. We all saw, we're all on social media and Twitter and everything. We saw last week, a leaked letter from a theater company where a donor, right, was writing because he didn't agree with some of the equitable, visionary decisions the artistic team was making, asking to purchase a nonprofit theater, right, and restore power back to the where wealth sits. Right. And so this idea of the of the risk that is involved in being visionary, and the risk that's involved, that's something for all of us to take into account as leaders stand before us and with bold visions, and thinking about how we can distribute power in a way where decisions can be made more equitably, and where folks can move forward boldly towards justice and liberation and diversity, or wherever we're at, without impunity, right? We know that risk is a big part, and we don't often talk about the risk that leaders take. So thank you so much for bringing that into the space here.
I think to that point, Alysia, also, and Stephanie, what you're alluding to is it is the power of philanthropy, right? And the way philanthropy is structured in this country. This is a very real issue, and for two reasons. First of all, one, that is how things get done in terms of the economics of the way organizations, exist. And the other piece of it is that it tends to get it, because of the way the model, as you all know, of philanthropy works, is it's a small number of donors at the highest level, and then, many more donors at a much lower level. But in terms of where 80% of that funding is coming from in most institutions, it's coming from a very select group of people. So I think it's working on the not just who those folks are, but that evolution there becomes a really important part of the conversation.
Fred, sorry to interrupt, but I'm watching the chat thread, and there's conversation going on about crowdsourcing and flattening out the investment model. I think that's absolutely could be an outgrowth of elevating the relevance and the value that you're delivering back to the community. But that has to happen first. It's impossible to ask for an investment in something that you don't feel is delivering value or relevance in your community.
So can we go back to Alicia's question? Because it's a thing that we tend to do. We tend to ask about the future, and then we say, well, here's the reason why we can't get to the future, instead of naming the future. So I want to, I introduce myself according to my institutional affiliation. I am a vice president at the Kennedy Center. I'm a poet and a librettist, and locate myself in my artist body while executing administrative and executive leadership tasks. That said, if we're talking about the future, I would like to get away from poetic values like freedom and progress and shit. Because I think that they handcuff us into a kind of amorphous, squishy place that doesn't actually move us. So if we're asking about the future, and maybe, Fred, this goes back to funding structures. I would like to think that as part of theories of change, we can identify within our cultural organizations very specific demographics and very specific civic inflection points to work on. So we were consulting with an organization not too long ago, and they were using words like freedom, you know, and through conversation, we distilled our efforts to talking about homelessness, mental health among students, among young populations, and then we broke it down even further to talk about homelessness in the First Nations community, mental health among young people, organizational stability among BIPOC artists, and environmental refugees. That kind of specificity, I know that we want to like serve everybody. And I know like this idea of the orchestra as a picture of, of kind of like diverse cooperation is really metaphorically gorgeous. But speaking as the poet, I'd like to get away from the metaphor and think about the direct service that we can do in coordination with our artistic service. And so when you talk about this future, Alysia, when you ask about this future, and when Fred talks about philanthropy and funding sources, I think that the future is financially incentivizing artistic organizations to cohere around civic issues and curating work, again, using performance more as midpoint than endpoint, or starting point as endpoint, to project civic inquiry into the public square and work on direct issues. It is cooperation with these actionable components at the end of performance.
So one quick comment maybe, and then this could go on for the next 2 hours. It's a fascinating conversation, but I am mindful of wanting to get to questions from folks that are listening in. But Damien, you.
Yes, that was brilliant. And to answer Alysia's question, I believe as artists for the future, we have to shift from accepting token titles and positions. A lot of these adjectives and acronyms are restricting, constricting, and will keep us in a place of being the needy, needing to be uplifted. There's a book by the former Senator Floyd Flake that talks about pulling yourself up from your own bootstraps. It's very difficult, but we as marginalized people are where we are now today because our ancestors did just that. When you think about Native Americans and all that they have not even received as far as proper recognition here, and how we're trying now with even being aware of the land that we now exist in and work from. I think it's about ownership. We have to become the donors in this construct of capitalism and the way that things work. We have to become the owners, the donors, the shareholders. We cannot, of course, the door opening may be because of A or D or E or I or IDA, however they put it, an idea, maybe those acronyms. But once we're in the seat, we have to not be comfortable, but we have to make sure that we become owners and that we become authorities and we become voices of reason for everything arts and everything creative, not just when it's a conversation about Black History Month or about this or Black Music Month or gospel music or jazz history. There's a great opportunity that I just turned down. I was beating myself, scratching my head this morning, like, whoa, great opportunity. But I said, I have to be very discerning as an artist and as a catalyst for change, that I am very careful what I accept. Is it a token posture and a token position, or just something that's going to create change. Of course, I identify as who I am. I am an African-American man, Black, however you want to call it, born in the South, adopted by parents who were raised in the 30s, who grew up on farms and drinking colored fountains. But at the same point, I have to make sure that the work I'm doing, that the legacy that I'm leaving, doesn't only fit into a hollowed space of token work. And that's a completely different conversation. Yeah.
May I add really quickly, just one question, response to what you just said and everything. I love the responses I've heard. There's a term in history that is a public historian. And so for me, the future is musicians who see themselves in the same way that public historians do, which is your work on the stage is integrated to your work outside of a concert hall. There is no separation between who you are, and so that you're bringing people in. And the other piece of that is that that movement from genres, that we stop thinking in those boxes. I'm a classical musician, so I have nothing to do with musicians or artists in other areas. That's, to me, because that's what students are talking about. They want to be able to sing an opera role and then turn around and do social activism. To them, it's one piece. And I hope that our training begins to shift. That's what the future for me looks like, is that the academy begins to make the shift with what the young people are already doing and finding our way into spaces, which will then help us begin to look at funding and everything else that in a different way. So I'll stop.
So that's just a great conversation. So we're gonna open it up to questions from our listeners. Lauren, do we have a question? How should arts organizations handle audiences that do not agree with or fight against the work being done around anti-racism, diversity, equity, and inclusion?
This is such a popular question.
How should government handle white supremacist members of the House of Representatives?
Yeah.
I mean, how should arts organizations handle audiences? Let's just look at this question. That do not agree with or fight against the work being done around, and let's separate this out, that do not agree with or fight against work being done around access. How do you handle audiences that are not down with inclusion? How do you handle, you know what I mean? Like, let's just look at this question and take a moral step back. Perhaps another question. What is the future of audience participation in the arts? Who is included in that future? What are arts organizations doing to expand the capacity and access to arts products and creative inquiry in their communities? You know, to quote the great Beyonce, boy, bye. Like, if you can't, like, if you're not down with the expansion of the tent in America, America actually doesn't have a place for you, dog. America hasn't had a place for me. And I'm a first generation American. I'm born of Haitian parents. America has not had a place for me for a long time. Now I don't have a place for you if you don't have a place for me. There's several million other people, though, that can fill your seat.
But I think from the arts organization's viewpoint, I think this is exactly right, Mark, that demographics are destiny. And we all know what audience trends look like historically over the last several decades for some of the performing arts. And you marry that to what demographics are going to look like in the next 20 to 30 to 40 years here. You can't, this question becomes, it's not even a relevant question. I'm not criticizing the person who asked the question. I'm simply saying that it is it's in the self-interest of the organizations actually to be thinking about it that way. I have lots of hands up.
I wanted to offer too. Boy, bye. I wanted to offer too that. So I'm a woman of color. I'm running an organization in a field that does not have a lot of us at the top. And I will say that the number of times that my work gets weaponized, or rather the inverse. Oh, so-and-so, that other organization, whether it doesn't even have to be in the field. Sometimes I'm here in Baltimore, sometimes it's the BSO gets weaponized against me and my decision. So what arts organizations can actually do is to stop that. There was don't allow that. Stop allowing people to weaponize anti-racism, ADEI work against the people who are trying to do it. And there's this, this is a little bit tea, but when I announced my first season at Baltimore Center Stage, it was predominantly Black and brown people who were animating the stories. And this is no surprise if you know me, that's what you get. And there is another organization in town. When they saw my first season announcement, the leadership said, "Oh, good, more subscribers for us." That's weaponization. That's weaponization. So what can we do? We can stop doing that.
Yes, I just wanted to say to this question, I can hear the words of my mentor, the late, great Jesse Norman, saying, move around. Just move around it. Move around those audiences that do not agree. And then to the arts organizations, take ownership and do the work. As Marc said, there will be other people to fill the seats. Let those people feel replaced. And that's really the big issue. That's the elephant in the room, fear. People in these positions at institutions are afraid of being replaced. Well, guess what? Your replacement is here. They know it. They don't want change. Change is already upon us. And soon they will be replaced. And if not, life has a way of recycling things. And people that don't want to change will just be moved around, and they will be think change will happen. So this is good. This is a good sign, though. The fight is good, and the fact that people don't agree is good, because it's a definite sign of change. If everything was peaceful and there was no conversation and there was no one pushing against the grain, there wouldn't be real work happening. So I think this is a good sign. So when an arts organization sees this, how do you handle the audience? Let them go. Let them complain. That's what art is all about. Let them express what they feel, while the artists express what they're called to do.
I love all of these responses. And I would only add, when folks ask this version of a question frequently, especially around arts education programs for arts organizations. We know that primarily organizations that are creating arts education programs, most of those programs started in the 70s and 80s as outreach, as an opportunity to generate some income around providing access to poorer Black and brown communities. So, and also that connection of diversity, right? That's where a lot of the diversity with photos were coming, was from the arts education programming. So I see a lot of folks asking this question. For me, as an arts education person, how can their audiences, as they shift, if they make, for instance, some of the pedagogical shifts that I recommend around allowing students to create new work and not centralizing the traditional methods of teaching, right? If they allow that, and students are sharing work that is sharing their personal experiences, what if donors don't like it, right? And also, a lot of the agreement that we have around racial equity is around some social contract of, if you make more space for diversity, your financial position later will be better. There is that contract involved. And I just want to push back on both of those ideas, because Black and brown people don't owe you anything as an arts organization. You should, when you are making your space more inclusive, or you're hoping to make space for diversity, that doesn't guarantee you'll get it. We don't owe you participation. I don't owe you my participation. If you're making your space more inclusive, that's because you are about humanity. And racial equitable spaces are humanistic spaces where everyone can thrive. So that's that intersectionality. And that's why racial justice is a great tool for humanizing our spaces, because racism deprives us of humanity and dignity for all people. And then the second piece is, this question often translates to me as, how can I play both fields? How can I place my bets here with Black and brown people in case that does happen and they become they have more financial power in the future? And also, what if it doesn't happen and these people over here who are standing and advocating for racism, is what I'm hearing, or at least for exclusion, right? Individuality, so against the principles of freedom and justice, how can I also, just in case they keep power too, not alienate myself from them? And I think the answer is you can't. You got to place your bets and you got to allow it to fall where it may, and the best to you. But you eventually do need to make a decision about what you value as an organization, and then find the people and community that match with those values, and understand that all of us have to be accepting when organizations, I love someone mentioned earlier about the white American theater. That's right. If you're not going to change, we just ask that you're transparent about that. That you just say, this is a space of exclusion. This is a space where we are valuing tradition over people. This is a space where we value stagnation over progress. And that's what we are. That's the kind of institution we are. And that's what we're looking for. And I guarantee you, there are people that will support that. So we do have to be honest and transparent about who we are. There's no way to serve both masters and to place your bets all around.
Can I just add to that absolutely, Alysia, that was right on the money. And can I add that I've always said, well, where were the people complaining about the fact that all the seasons and that were all white? Nobody ever made a comment or complaint until they started to see some different narratives come into the performance space. And I agree with you. You have to just hedge your bets. I mean, when the Met put on Fire Shut Up in My Bones, which I went to, the place was packed. When opera companies have put on Porgy and Bess for centuries, the places are packed. The power of the dollar of Black and brown people has been underestimated and underutilized. So if people start to wake up and pay attention to it, there are financial gains that can happen by presenting these stories. And then lastly, if your organization is not is concerned about this, why don't you look at the board that you have? What diversity and what power do you have on your board to help with these? Again, that's going back to who's in power in your organizations. So I'll just stop there.
So I'm gonna jump in here and see if we can. I mean, it's again a great conversation and obviously a strong reaction to the question. So Lauren, another question. Okay, how do teams move from talking about ideas to doing them within organizations? How does meaningful action begin once conversation and trainings are happening? And this is
may I?
Mark, please.
There's obviously a relationship between the last question and this one, and it underscores the necessity of theory of change or pedagogy and a kind of long-term vision, because we tend to operate within the scope of fiscal calendars, and you're not going to cure homophobia in a fiscal calendar year. You're not going to eradicate heterosexism. You're not going to dismantle the patriarchy. You're not going to abolish white supremacy within the space of one fiscal year or even two. So, but what can you do? And I think the environment is instructive. The way that government, at the very least, talks about environment is very instructive here, because government says by the year 2040, X, by the year 2050, Y, by the year 2035, C, right? One of the problems I think that we have, and one of the points of tension, is that we are actually not asking our colleagues within our organizations to buy into a vision. We're asking them to execute on a program. And that's very different. And also, we're not talking about what we intend on doing by the year 2025. We're talking about the show that we intend to put on. And so in the face of that mountain, and you mentioned the production at the Met, I think that's also very instructive. What happened after that show? Can any of us say? When is the next time? What is the strategy? What is the program? So moving teams from talking about ideas to doing them, I think also, includes the articulation of the strategy and a kind of scaffolded approach to execution. So that you're not just having the conversation and you're not just talking about the trainings, you're saying, this is our 5-year plan. The same way that you have a 5-year strategic plan to do anything else. What is your 5-year strategic plan? What is the tactical plan that goes with it? What happens after fire shut up in my bones? What happens after we do that? This is the thing that we're building towards. And I think that the integration of theory of change and pedagogy is really important towards achieving that.
That seems like so important for us to also wrap our head around the vastness of our arts institutions, right? So it's like the bookkeeper has an understanding of the vision for the organization. The administrative assistant who gets to decide where the catering comes from has an understanding of the vision of the organization around racial equity or homophobia or whatever social piece. And everyone can be bought into how they play a role in creating transformation and change. Stephanie?
I would offer two things or I don't know if it's two. Anyway, I think that this path and this journey can feel super overwhelming. And so I'll once again invoke emergent strategy and say that small is all. You start just like Marc said, you start where we start. And so small is all. And every single one of us has a lever that we can push. And I think iteration, we rehearse every day in our our rehearsal rooms, and we somehow, when it comes to this work on the administrative side or legislating and culture change, somehow we think we're going to get it right the first time. We rehearse it, we iterate, you learn, and you keep going. And so often the beginning is actually vocabulary. Like, if you don't know where to start with your words. And I'm seeing in the chat some conversation about the big intellectual words. Just Google it, break it down, walk it back, and then understand it, and then start implementing the vocabulary into your own. So I think that I think small is all, and iteration is key.
Can I just add? I was going to say. X is the next one at the Met, by the way, Marc. So they do have plans for continuing that. But Stephanie actually took what I was going to say, which is having a vision and a strategy and planning it step by step. We do know how to do this. We are so, as musicians and artists, we are so good at taking a score to its smallest nth degree. And I know every chord, every word, every translation. Why don't we do the same thing when we have to do this with new strategies? We have to just work it the same way, a piece at a time.
And I would say that in that sense, this issue mirrors a lot of other large strategic issues that an organization has to grapple with and will have to do over not just 5 years, but often several decades. And you have to be able to think, at least on that timeline, even though you're not acting on the things 10 years out necessarily, you're acting on those things that are local and immediate, and maybe even easier wins initially, success to build on. But I think you've got to be thinking about it over the long term, and that it's here to stay. It's not something that is this work will go on.
Yes, we get so confused when we bring in race, because we do know how to problem solve. In fact, that's what we know how to do best as artists. Yes, we know how to break things into small chunks. We know how important it is. I love when Louise said, that small is all, Adrienne Marie Brown. And that's all musicians know how to do is rehearse one measure for a whole lesson. We've all had those lessons where I'm sure the actors have had do that same sentence again. The beats still aren't right. Okay. So we've all had those experiences. And then how I love when Marc talks about bringing his artist body to the administrative thinking, how do you transfer those artist skills over? I tell my Peabody students that all the time. You have all of the makings of revolutionary. Everything a revolutionary person would want, you have all of those skills because of your artistic practice. And then how do you own that? That feels like another opportunity to sense the power, the infinite power that we all have within.
So, Lauren, you want to put up another question? Do you have recommendations for how to push the passion for change upwards in an organization? Yeah, that's an interesting question, right? Top down versus bottom up. Thoughts? Jonathan?
I think about this every day. It's not unidirectional is the answer. And, you know, what's above me as CEO is the board of directors. What's quote unquote below me, I'm not even comfortable with the vertical model, but what's below me is you know, everybody else in the organization. I think you have to push in both directions. This and it gets back to what Marc said a little while ago, or at least how I heard it. We started with Cincinnati Symphony by setting a vision, a completely changed vision from where we were. And our vision is to be the most relevant orchestra in America. And, you know, so you've got to really have some tough conversations about what that means, because it really becomes a question of value. Who values you? And the other belief, and Fred and you and I have talked about this, is that orchestras exist to serve the community. They don't exist to serve the music. They exist to serve the community. They use music to serve it. They use the power of music to serve it. So I think the CEO's job is to do the push and the pull in both directions simultaneously. I can't imagine a place where it wouldn't be that way. That said, I will say that if you look at the so-called stakeholders in our organization internally, the catalysts, the folks who have the greatest desire for velocity of change is the staff. And I think part of it is because we have a better sense of what the future looks like. You know, 97% of our current audience is white, and 46% of our current audience will be dead in 10 years. That we know. That's just data. And so what are you going to do about it? And so that's one of several imperatives for change. But yeah, I think it's the job of the CEO to create change and accept that it's going to be uncomfortable for a while.
And I'm seeing in the chat too, just a call for the sharing of actionable steps, strategies, just that as we continue to talk about this, a both and approach. I'm seeing that in the chat.
Could I just add one more little asterisk to that, and maybe it helps answer it? Don't wait for an improved culture in your organization to start doing stuff. It's actually the other way around. Start by changing your policies. Start by changing what you're doing. Over time, I think that will habituate different practices. And only then can you begin to think about how that informs cultural change. But I think if you were to sit there and say, okay, we're going to change the culture of the organization, you got to start by doing.
I think that's really an important point. When you talk about diversifying a community, I mean, we've focused a lot on that at Peabody, and then you grapple with the issue of, okay, so what kind of a community are we bringing people into? And is it a community that's going to be inclusive for everybody and equitable for everybody and productive for everybody?
Can I add to what Jonathan just said? I agree that it is two-way. It's not just on one. But I do know that if the head does not have that space where they really communicate that, then the bottom can't push up. Right. It has to know that there is that openness in that space. And so some actionable steps might even be having incentives to hear some good ideas and good ways from those, the players. I'm just thinking your organization is Symphony. So if you have the people at the top, is there a space or a mechanism where those that are players that have a great idea might have a place to go with ways that they can suggest change and feel confident in doing that? Because most people are not going to feel comfortable just going straight up if they don't know that the top is actually willing to invest in it. And investing, I'm thinking, again, just because you said orchestra, I'm thinking of, for instance, maybe an orchestra always puts their only works by an African-American in Black History Month. And the players are trying to get that to become a part of the season. So they need to know that that is something that would be interested, that there would be interest in that, or that the community wants to see some different things. So a pipeline that allows space for that.
I would also offer to, so the very well-known business school phrase, culture eats strategy for lunch, is coming to mind. And I'm going to harken back to power. So you can legislate only so far when it comes to the culture of an organization. And everybody has power to change and shift the culture. Everybody. We go back to words, we go back to, but I want to give a really concrete example of maybe something that folks can practice. Transparency. Maximum appropriate transparency. Can you push the CEO or the head of the organization to be transparent? Maybe, maybe not. Can you be transparent with your colleagues? Absolutely. So in my organization, I did not legislate salary sharing, except on our job postings. But what happened was, in my organization, the folks who work at Baltimore Center Stage started sharing their salaries with each other. At my behest, I sort of go. So they have a Google Doc where they share their salaries. That is not legislated. That's an action that is happening at a sort of lateral level within the organization, and it forces me to engage in different kinds of conversations when I have my staff members and team members saying, we are talking about this. So it just goes back to organizing and force multiplication, that it doesn't need to rely on one person, and it doesn't there's only so much you can do, I guess, before you have to hear it from the top. But there's so much that can be done before you need the top to engage at all.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah. My biggest advocate institutionally is my development department. And the first meeting that I arranged when I started working at the Kennedy Center 3 years ago was with the development team. Change upwards. If there's and this is why pipeline is so important. If there is someone outside of the organization that can financially support your vision, that's the greatest way to implement change. In the same way that you have financial advocates for a particular curatorial vision, or particular ancillary programs, maybe you have folks that are really keyed into education. The thing that expands the bottom line or expands the base of the pyramid in terms of the financial sustainability of an organization actually is social equity, because it is. And this goes back to Garrett's initial comments. Social equity is not part of the genetics of this country, let alone the various organizations. However, there is a vast amount of wealth that believes in and seeks to sustain equity measures and equity vision. When Donald Trump was elected in 2016, all these people donated to the ACLU. All these people donated to these advocate or the Legal Defense Fund, these advocacy organizations. A lot of those same people should have donated to arts organizations, because if the fear was that some of our democratic institutions were going to erode, then we should have been thinking about cultural organizations as part of the spectrum of institutions that we have that preserve the democracy. So where are we aligned in terms of philanthropy that respects social equity, and how can we align them within our cultural trajectory? If we have that alignment and we welcome that kind of philanthropy into our organizations, then leadership at the top pays attention because there's a dollar attached to the vision.
So Marc, you were the first to answer the first question, and you're going to be the last to answer the last question here today. This was a really, really great, we're literally out of time, but this was a really fantastic panel, really thoughtful and candid and very forward-looking. I found it just really an interesting conversation, and really grateful to all of you for being here. And Alysia, great co-moderator, thank you. And we will see everybody back with another panel, another presentation at 1 o'clock. And hope you'll hang in there with us for the rest of the day. Great. Thank you all.